about the possibility of a red Deleuze or a black Deleuze, or both, and what that means, and what that means with regarding philosophy's apparent allergy towards anarchism. In the Deleuzian community, there are many who veer away from a political reading of Deleuze and any alignment of his thought with the political philosophy of anarchism and indeed communism. Indeed, many have forgotten the political dimension to his work and somehow offer instead a Bergsonian vitalist Deleuze, or a Deleuze who will be remembered as a pure metaphysician. Others might disagree, but I still believe the dialogue on Deleuze and anarchism is a timely and necessary one, especially with the rise of fascism across the planet. And in recent years, there's been a renewed interest in anarchism as a philosophical and political idea. And Catherine Malabou's work, and indeed Peter Kuber's collaboration is one example. And this also took on earlier forms, including thought experiments on post-structuralist anarchism. Todd May influenced me in the 1990s, as indeed did post-anarchism, Saul Newman's work. Well, then more recently, there's the dark negative aspects of Deleuze's philosophy, which has been taken up by Andrew Culp, which brings Deleuze close to a kind of a very clear anarchist stance. And as I mentioned with Catherine Malabou's work, so in contemporary French philosophy especially, there's been an attempt to introduce the idea of anarchism into mainstream philosophical debate. And with that, there's a kind of resistance and an allergy towards that idea. So I've been considering the debates and discussions by Catherine Malabou on this idea of an allergy towards anarchism with great interest. But for me, like, the question of Deleuze's anarchism, or the influence of Deleuze on anarchist thought, is very timely, as it touches upon the unthought in Deleuze's work and the question of what to do with Deleuze's thought. So the unthought in Deleuze is the question for me of the open gesture, perhaps, as he calls it, towards Marx and Marxism, and towards the grandeur of Marx. And I'm very much looking forward to Alex Taekwon Lee's book on this subject, because I think he's going to answer many of these questions. Well, in my own work, this is the question of the glasnost thought, or the opening and anticipatory thought in Deleuze, which I get from Kostas Axelos. And I think this gesture is consistent with contemporary philosophy's search for a new image of thought. And so an anarchist perspective sensitive to Deleuze's thought might ask precise questions on what future images of politics or of society can we find in Deleuze's thought, which go against the current doxa. And I think this is what is picked up by Chantelle in the question of prefiguring, or I think this is what Deleuze would call a philosophy fiction, the philosophy fiction of anarchism. But in what sense? Ethical or political? And I would like to hear about this today. So are the two senses invariably separated? And in what sense can we re-signify communism or anarchism with a sense of the world, the cosmos, the globe, epoch, and the planetary? So with that in mind, it's my great pleasure to have Professor Chantelle Gray from South Africa, from Northwest University, today to talk about her new work on Deleuze and anarchism. So Chantelle, would you kindly offer some thoughts about the direction and inspiration of the book and the conclusions you made about philosophy and anarchism and the so-called resistance of philosophy to anarchist politics?
Yeah, thank you, Geoff, and thank you, Alex and Manoj, for having me. So I think you raise kind of interesting provocations there, this allergy to anarchism being the first one. And I think that is actually, it is something we need to address, still today. When one says the word anarchism, you have these, you either have ideas of the Sex Pistols or spray painted A's in circles, protests, chaos. And of course, there is something to that. There is something to protests, to the kind of revolutionary politics that is part of anarchism, just as much as things like mutual aid and solidarity are. And so I think for me, one of the things in writing this book, for me, there is a revolutionary strain to Deleuze and Guattari's political thought that I think has been picked up, as you say, by post-anarchists. But I really wanted to explore this a little bit more and kind of remove it from a mere Marxist reading. Of course, they were influenced by Marxism, but they were also critical of Marxism. And I think that's an important point that we have to remember. And I think for me, you know, obviously the digital milieu is something that I think about very carefully, what it's doing to subjectivity. You know, for us in teaching settings, I think all of us see this kind of disaffection that Stigler talks about in our students. And it's worrying, you know, it's worrying to see the world around us and what is happening. And I think what surprised me is that the book was actually hopeful in the end, even though I think that I'm quite misanthropic most of the time. So it was a kind of surprise to myself. But I think that for me is actually part of the power of Deleuze and Guattari and anarchism, is that it is a hopeful politics. It is something that wants to create a future that it is worth living for and that is worth fighting for. And so I think it asks quite difficult questions about, you know, how we do that, how we critique what is around us without falling into despair. And so for me, you know, beyond the kind of obvious resonances between Deleuze and Guattari and anarchism, you know, like the big things, capitalism, anti-capitalism, anti-statism, those are the kind of easy things to read in their work and see, you know, these are the affinities between them. But of course, this idea of believing in this world is actually the thing that kind of struck me in the end. You know, what does it mean to believe in this world? What does it mean to prefigure a politics, to find new communal ways of living together when our world is so aimed at individualism and at these kind of, you know, making each of us a kind of, or reducing us to consumers. And so the question of politics for me is really important because I think it is the only way forward. It is at least one of the powerful means we have to come together and resist and find new ways, produce new ways of living, and even produce new meanings that can help us deal with things like even with climate change. You know, it's such a big issue, and as we can see, states are failing, and it's you know, it's one of those hyper objects, so it's very difficult to think about. You know, the idea of changing your life in a way that makes a difference, it almost feels undoable. And so I guess that's what is interesting for me about Deleuze and Guattari and anarchism, is that it tries to deal almost with these problems that feel like they're too big.
But thank you very much for that. So, would anybody like to about what I was discussing? Go on.
Okay, so Job, I think that the connection is not good. Please.
All right.
All right. So anyway, just very very impressed by actually what Chantelle, you know, delivered. The about the main topic, and then what you actually, the interest in recently. And then, actually, my actually, question, when reading your book, actually, the last chapter is a very actually impressive. Also the resonated what I'm interested in these days is how revolution is still possible, in the age of post-revolution, the post-revolution world. Now there are lots of people, even leftists, talk about the post-revolution. Revolution is impossible, and I think. But if you are interested in the philosophy or the some kind of philosophy of politics or whatever, actually, you must pay attention to this impossibility of revolution. That is my question. So actually, your book, I think, try to give some insight, against that kind of common belief, the revolution no longer, possible, something like that. You actually try to challenge, that kind of idea. That's what I love, this your argument, and then in this actual book, and then but actually, my question is, okay, just you talk about the anarchism, and you also, the emphasized the importance of state or some, government pillar, something like that. Of course, I think that we are witnessing, such a failure through this kind of a pandemic, moment. Then they try pretend to themselves, doing something, but doing nothing, Then actually, they let them people die, and just what Foucault said is like, biopolitical, sense is, and let people live, alone, and something like that. So my idea is that actually, okay, just we are witnessing this one, and then actually the state would always, fail. That means that from the beginning, the state will be, the paving way toward this kind of failure. I think, and then if you said, okay, just the state failed, so that's why we should get out of this kind of the trap, or some capturing machine, and then we should get to some such a anarchistic, politic. I think I could agree with that. But thing is that people do not, give up, the lingering, their desire to this kind of state. That means what actually they really want is a perfect state, not, abolishment of state. And through last decade or some, even, the last century, we actually witnessed that. You actually described, that anarchism or some kind of the betrayal of Lenin's betrayal of such an anarchist, the after, the Russian Revolution. And we know all these kind of story, and then what happened in the last century. But, in those days, we had such a utopian hope, toward a better future. But, lots of frustration, the historical actually, failure. And then we saw the lots of depressive, the fact, which actually a little bit register what we believe today. So in this sense, okay, just I don't think any, the people would, actually would be against this kind of anarchistic, ideal. But my problem is how can we actually bring in this kind of ideal, and then in actually the realistic sense. That means, of course, anarchism wouldn't be actually realism. It's against the state realism. It's okay. But if you wanna, actually realize this kind of ideal something agenda, we need some kind of, the political, the plan or something like that. And then, so my point is, people actually desiring, this kind of state, perfect state. They don't want to actually give up this, actually state power. And then this is, in my opinion, the problem of modernity, or some, as Foucault, already pointed out, kind of disciplinary power is the beginning of this kind of modern state. And then also Foucault and I don't know, actually, the Deleuze and Guattari, you already described in your book, is a Urstaat, concept of Urstaat. And then they try to persuade us, the state, the problem of states is not only actually stuck to this kind of modernization, or it's not a modernity problem, but like some sort of problem of our civilization in general, or something like that. And then that means that they try to shift this topic from the kind of political economy to the desire, problem of desire. So I think the idea of anarchism is very the powerful, very persuasive at the moment. But my question is, how can we actually bring in that kind of ideal to this kind of real politics or something like that? So, and how can we actually change the people's desire? That is actually a little bit big question. I don't have any answer. I'm just curious.
So thank you. Yeah, thank you for that, Alex. But I think what you've just raised is probably the question that anarchists try to grapple with and answer. And of course, many people talk about, or I think a lot of people raise the question of like scale, is it possible at scale? Of course, it'll work in small communities, but can we have stateless societies at scale? How do we change desire? It's this, I think it's that idea that there's this wonderful ideal, but it's just not possible. And for me, this is what I described as statist realism in my book, this idea that the state is kind of the limit of our horizon. We keep thinking if we change the content of the state, it will be better, despite all evidence against this. And so it's almost like this, it's kind of like a trick, I think, that the state has played on us. It's this idea that the state, at heart, actually, the state is benevolent, and look, it provides us with some services. It at least keeps us from killing each other. There's a certain amount of cohesion, and this is what we call society. And I think that there are a number of things here. Of course, it has to do with now years of entrenched ideas around nationality, around what a society is, what it means to live in a society. And I think the funny thing is that a lot of that has been eroded. And for me, this is where Deleuze and Guattari are very useful, because I think it is at the level of desire. I think people do desire statist societies because everything else seems, it's like, if you start thinking about how we change society, it feels like such a big task that, people are like, but where do we start? But then I think that there are really good examples. And I think this is why many anarchists look to the Zapatistas and also Rojava, because I think these are large-scale projects that are, of course, not explicitly anarchist, but certainly anarchistic, and they've been influenced by anarchists too, so they do understand anarchist principles. But I think that those are large-scale projects that show us how mutual aid works, how you can have kind of, like the Zapatistas have the juntas, and they kind of organize themselves within these territories. And so I think part of it, so when we talk about desire, and so this is something that I think about a lot, but it's actually this like, there's something about the affective that I think is underexplored in anarchism, because, when you do work together, like when you, whether you work in a communal garden together, whether you're doing food not bombs, whether you're protesting together, that creates a different kind of feeling of what is possible when you get together and do something. And I think this is a large problem in our societies because we're all, for very many reasons, we're all stuck behind computers for long hours of the day or on phones. And I think part of changing desire is even starting at small scale operations, doing things together to start seeing, oh, this can actually make a change in my community in this way. And once you start, because that's the thing that changed for me, like I had all these questions too when I became an anarchist. I also thought, I asked all the questions that everybody else asked. Who's going to take out the trash? Who's going to whatever? Who's going to do this? And I think those are important things. When you start establishing ways in which you can look after your community, yourself, and we saw this with the floods in New Orleans. A lot of anarchists, in fact, stepped in and provided the services that were needed. And I think once you start having that feeling, that starts changing the desire. Oh, wait, we can do this. We can do this on our own. What else can we do on our own? And I think for me, this, you brought up COVID, but for me, this was so interesting because there was so much disinformation, so much, around who do you trust, who don't you trust. And for me, actually, like thinking, anarchists also make this distinction between power to and power over, but also like natural authority. If you're a doctor, of course, we know the medical system in its bigger systemic way, does have power over us. But let's just say you're a doctor, you're doing your best in your community. I would trust you with certain questions I have, just as you might trust me with other questions, with things that I can do. And the moment we start building together in that way, I think it also teaches you something different about power, because I think part of this, how do we change desire, is that it's almost like we're so used to giving up our power all the time. Like if you just think about like your workspace and how you're in committees and how people make decisions for you, that, for example, and I see how quickly people, it always interests me how quickly people just accept things. Oh, this person made this decision for me. Okay, I'm just gonna now do it. And even that kind of like rearranging that kind of thing where you're like, but hold on, why can't we talk about this? Why can't we reach consensus? The moment you start doing that, people have a different experience even of their own power. And I think that literally is what changes desire. It starts with kind of small scale experimentation and prefiguration. And it does, I truly do believe this. It does require us to get away from technology for specific periods of time and practice community.
Thank you. So any more questions? Otherwise, should I respond? Yeah, actually, a nice answer, and then I think I expected that kind of answer, and then you are very skillfully persuade audience. I think I think people wanna be an anarchist, listening to you when you talk. Mutual aid, okay. But actually, my comment is not a question, and then not critique of what you said. Is more like okay, mutual aid, and then we have such a ideal image of community, communal actually help each other, and even during this kind of pandemic, lots of government, did failed, the policy, but it's okay. But people try to help each other, very okay, just nihilists would say this is instinct, our human instinct, something like that. But I don't think that is human instincts. That's related to desire. And then, but actually, my comment on that is, okay, I think that the point is that whether you are anarchist or whether you are something else, but you would declare yourself something, you know, I'm anarchist. That declaration as such might be political, in my opinion, beyond, as you said, kind of axiomatic of a state and the axiomatic of a governmentality. That's, I think, very important. And then that it might be a breakpoint or some we can make, against this kind of state power. And then, yeah, that I think what occurred, struck me, when you talked. And
if I can just also quickly respond to that, but I do think there's, at the end of the book, I also write about burning even the last black flag. And so I think that even though, for me, there are two things. I do think it's, I think that there is power in saying something like I'm an anarchist and these are the people I associate with. These are the histories. I mean, there's a long history of theory and practice that I draw on. But I also think a very big thing that does need to be addressed in our contemporary societies is to build bridges between different leftist groups. Who cares if you're an autonomous Marxist or an anarchist in the end, if we're building bridges that make our world better? So I do think that that is also something, getting beyond factionalism is actually a really important issue that needs to be addressed too.
Can I say something if you can hear me? You can hear me now, right? So that the idea of the faction that you mentioned has always been really important to me, because in the 1990s, when I was reading a lot about Murray Bootkin, the social ecologist, social anarchist, and I actually went to see him when he came to England and things like that. He came to Leeds University, and it was a rainy Tuesday evening. I remember going and getting a cold the day after, but it was very much worth it. But I read everything that he published, and I thought it was so important to this thinker, a very interesting character in himself, but this thinker was concerned with domination. And you talk about that in the book. And what is domination, and why is it that one person or one person dominates another person or another living being on this planet and things like that? It's so important for me. And then early 1990s, I began reading Deleuze and Guattari, and then of course I realized that Guattari had the three ecologies, just published in the late 1980s, I think. So I began reading about the three ecologies, and it was totally kind of a revelation for me that these two thinkers were actually considering similar issues. So why is it that one person dominates another person or another living thing? It's not just an environmental or a societal question. It's actually at the level of psychological domination or mental. What would you say? Like a mental question. So, but then the factionalism, and it was the question. So how would an intellectual like Deleuze or an intellectual like Guattari speak to a man on the ground like Murray Bootkin, a very smart, intelligent man on the ground working to transform the society in which he was living? So there was a disconnect there between these two positions, but they were talking a great deal about similar issues. And then Murray Bootkin, of course, he would just dismiss the Deleuze as like a lifestyle anarchist, just concerned with changing my clothes or listening to the Sex Pistols or maybe having a black flag in your house or something like that. So there's a radical disconnect between those two factional worldviews. So my interest has always been if those two, like say those two worldviews or ways of life couldn't have a dialogue, then there's not much hope for having a dialogue with liberals or people who are conservative thinkers. So how do you agree with that? And how do you begin to, like, through your project, how do you begin to resurrect that kind of dialogue?
Good.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's so interesting that you bring up those two thinkers, because of course, for me, they resonate too. Those two projects, the three ecologies and Bookchin's work it's almost like you're reading the same thing, but just from a slightly different perspective. And so, you know, I do also talk about that in the book, because Bookchin is, of course, also, he was hugely influential on the Rojava project. So for me, there's something like a living legacy going on, which I find really, it's kind of heartening almost. But I also think, you know, I think if we can't have these, of course, you know, there are certain principles that one, or convictions that one has. But I do think that beyond the jargon, for example, of intellectualism, we have to be able to have conversations with people on the ground, with workers, with mine workers, for example. This is, of course, a big issue in South Africa, or with, or with liberals, or even, how do we address the problem, the rising of the right wing? And I see this even in my classrooms. So how do we address this if we can't have these conversations without compromising either what we think or making the other person feel either like an idiot or like they don't have a voice? Because I think a lot of it, I think what the right wing does, or what they have, what they've been successful at, is recognizing that there's this gap in society, especially in young people, who feel quite lost. And there are these straightforward answers. It's easy answers. You know, when you have a kind of more situational ethics or something like that, it's very difficult to just, then you don't have these like straightforward answers that you're giving people. And I think it's very important to make, for me, this is also an ongoing question. Like, how do we build these bridges? Because I see so much factionalism, even in like the left in South Africa, for example. It's really a big problem. And then I think we could be doing all this stuff together in very easy ways if we just cared a little bit less about, one small thing and saw the bigger picture. And so for me, the bigger picture is actually part, I think, of what can help us build these bridges. For example, how the widespread disaffection, this is a big problem that we need to address. Our ecological crisis is it's ecological collapse, really. This is a huge problem. We can address this. These are problems we can address beyond, like, whether you have a black and red flag or you want a vanguard, you're more vanguardist rather than not. I think that there are ways that we can and should. I think we should, because our lives kind of depend on it.
Yeah.
Petra?
Okay.
Do you have a question?
Sure. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity and thank Chantelle for her book, which is, in my view, truly amazing and very important, especially in those days. And as Alex pointed out, we are living in times of failing state, which, however, leaves no alternative. And we are more and more drawn in a kind of collective suicide that we can see, for instance, today in Ukraine, in this suicidal war, which basically leaves us only two options. Either we side with Russian imperialism or we side with NATO. But there seems to be no alternative. And I think this is why it's so important to think of anarchist utopias, because basically they are not some kinds of dream futures, but they allow us to think. They open up alternatives which are missing today. So I think this is why Chantelle's book is so important, because it in a way teaches us to renew belief in the world. This concept of anarchistic utopia is really something that makes possible thinking in the situation where we see no alternatives. And the same goes for the prefigurative politics. So I really love the book, and I think Chantelle did a great job in showing the proximity of Deleuze and Guattari's thought and anarchist thought and practice. However, I would like to ask Chantelle if she sees any point where Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy cannot be reconciled with anarchist theory, because there is not only one anarchism, there are many anarchisms. So I wonder if you also see the limits in this kind of proximity you so nicely and convincingly demonstrated. So this would be my first question, and then I have a follow-up question, but I would like to start with this one.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I'm going to start with what works, obviously, right? So I think what is very good about bringing these thinkers or these oeuvres and histories together, because as you say, there are many, is that they, this is actually where I want to return to, Alex, also to the idea of revolution, is that for me, it's actually the revolutionary side and the kind of, even a kind of joyful militancy, one can say, in Deleuze and Guattarian anarchism that work for me together, and that I think is really powerful for thinking about the problems we face today. Because I think in fact, when I wrote the book, I didn't want to write about revolution because it's such a difficult topic to write about. And I first thought that I'm going to just ignore it. And then when I got to the end, I realized I can't ignore this idea of revolution because it's so integral to anarchism. And I actually found it quite integral to Deleuze and Guattari's work too. It was revolutionary when it came out, and it has a revolutionary impetus throughout. Of course, Deleuze and Guattari weren't anarchists. And I think, one shouldn't try and kind of post hoc label them anarchists or try and make them anarchists. They ignored much of anarchist history, is what it seems like. Of course, they were, especially Guattari had contact, and they clearly were influenced by the milieu, at least. But I think that for me is a limitation in remembering. We have to remember that Deleuze and Guattari weren't themselves anarchists. And so, although they work clearly, has anarchist principles, that I think I've tried to tease out in a strong way. They didn't practice the politics of anarchism, and I think that is a limitation for me. I feel that those practices are very integral to anarchism. And we learn that from anarchists. We learn about these different practices that they've been refining over hundreds of years now from anarchism. And you can't actually learn that from the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari. So I would say that is then the limitation of bringing them together, is not to confuse them with anarchists, but to actually learn also about anarchism and about the history and in terms of its theory and practices from anarchism.
Okay, thank you very much. And by the way, speaking of your book, I really appreciate that in the 6th chapter you mention Nestor Makhno and his anarchist movement in Ukraine, especially in those times. In those times of Ukrainian war, it's really a wonderful and important example that shows that even a failed attempts still allow us to think of alternatives, alternative histories that may change our view of what's going on today. So it's a wonderful example that should be remembered, I believe. And this brings me to my second question, and it's related to the concept of violence, also in the that is being discussed in the 6th chapter of your book. You speak of anarchist, the concept of violence and contra-violence, and I wonder if there is something in Deleuze and Guattari that could be also used as a possible approach to anarcho-pacifism, which can do without the concept of violence, which actually is capable to base the whole idea and practice of resistance not on war or fight, but on the idea of peace. So it seems to me that precisely this anarcho-pacifism is quite important stream in anarchist movement, and it shows how complex the question of violence or non-violence can be. And I would like to ask you what you would say about anarcho-pacifism from Deleuze-Guattarian perspective, and or more generally about the violence or non-violence in the anarchistic practice.
So, of course, this is this is one of the continuing reasons why people are anti-anarchist. I think is they concentrate on, like, especially the sort of early 20th century, the violence that broke out then. But I think that any anarchist will tell you that their first impulse is not towards violence, but towards pacifism, or at least most anarchists, I would say that. I don't think anarchists want to necessarily take up arms or be violent. I think that actually most contemporary anarchists focus a lot more on what we can create, alternative futures that we can create in the here and now. And I think, this is an interesting question in Deleuze and Guattari, because of course they have this very strong concept of the war machine. And so I think, one often thinks of this kind of idea of violence because of this word war. But of course, they do also focus on very many other, when they talk about the body without organs and all of this kind of thing. For me, the body without organs is actually it's a very interesting chapter, because it's almost like a manual for how to experiment in life in ways that are productive and not actually harmful. And so that's why they talk about how the body without organs can be botched and so on. But on the question of violence, I do think it is an important aspect to raise, because I do, and I really like Natasha Leonard's this word counter-violence, or concept of counter-violence, and how she defines it is as the impossibility of non-violence. And I think that, for me, lies at the heart of anarchist violence. It's not even violence against, it's the impossibility of non-violence in order to live or survive. And, I think it's been overemphasized in anarchism by non-anarchists to kind of discredit anarchism. So I think this idea of violence is far bigger outside of anarchism than it is actually in anarchism. Although it is not discounted. I think that there is space, for me, at any rate, there is space for violence. But there are many pacifist anarchists, as you say, and people who concentrate on different ways of living, of practicing. It makes me think of almost like the Buddhist principles of not doing harm and so on. So I think that they are definitely, I would say it's a stronger component, this idea of creating worlds together than of being violent. And
so Manoj, sorry,
Yeah.
I think Manoj, you should really jump in here, because this is,
Yeah,
Gandhi
so
and
No, I was thinking of this. Actually, this was my question also. But I would like I would like to invite all of you to the Global South right now, just in the context of anarchism. Thanks, Chantelle, for the book. It was very interesting and very clearly woven together the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari and its synthesizes with anarchism. It was an interesting read. While I was reading this book, also being a student activist and a political activist in my country, and I was also looking for anarchism in the Global South or in the Indian subcontinent or something. In terms of how, in what terms do people sort of embedded in this particular history, the Global South, generate theory and praxis regarding the questions of anarchism, or in terms of the intersections, articulations, or affinities or points of contact with the Western tradition of anarchist politics. When I look for the figures, two important figures as far as India is concerned, those who are very emblematic of the architecture of political dissent in India. One is Gandhi and other is Ambedkar. And I've found it really complicated because I don't know whether they can really fit into the larger Western tradition of diverse tradition of anarchist politics in that sense. One is Ambedkar, who was the champion of the lower caste people, the Dalit politics, and who was also at the same time who wrote the Constitution of India. And he actually kind of dissolved anarchism in clear terms. But he's a revolutionary figure, the revolutionary figure we saw too. And both of them, the point at which connect both Ambedkar and Gandhi is use of the religion as a means of protest. Gandhi uses it, Ambedkar uses it very, very evidently. You were talking about Buddhism. Ambedkar converted the lower caste people into Buddhism. But that was not a traditional Buddhism, but a different sort of Buddhism. He once proclaimed that I was born Hindu, I will not die a Hindu. And he kept his word in that sense. So it is a sort of a departure from the so-called European secular tradition of dissent or sort of revolutionary politics or something. And one more point, one more example I want to bring in from my own personal experience as a political activist in Kerala, for that matter. I'm part of an ecological movement, a larger ecological movement in Kerala. So in that sense, you were talking about certain indigenous movements and all. I don't know, I have no clear idea about the movement that you are talking about, the micro politics of it, how the power operates at the micro level. But as far as the third world are concerned, mostly I would like to bring in Negri's Empire and all, in which he talks about the role of NGOs in the fight against the empire. But it becomes really complicated in the context of the global south or third world countries. Mostly in these kind of smaller indigenous protests and ecological movements, most of the NGOs are mostly funded by Western, like large conglomerates or like, sort of, it's at the micro level, there is not so much of politics to it. You cannot really avoid that politics, or you cannot really sort of not confront the politics of it. So they might have certain political and economic vested interest and all. So in theory, I do completely agree with you, but in practical terms, I don't know whether we have to provincialize anarchism in that sense.
Yeah, it's the question of the global south is, of course, it is a difficult question because, of course, I'm also from the global south. These are questions that face us all the time, right? We continue to be exploited by the West, our countries, our economies. People live in such poverty. And I think those, when you're faced with that at a real everyday level, it is very difficult to think about, can I just bring my politics and, how does it make a difference in a township or, that kind of thing. So I think here, one of the interesting things is that Latin America really has a strong history of anarchism. And of course, they are the global south. So I think that there are real examples that we can learn from. But I also think that there are, it's interesting you talked about religion, but of course, churches are it's kind of interesting because, it was used in the US to mobilize movements, but also in South Africa. And so I find that it is a far more complex question, to just say, we're anti this or we're anti that. It does become this kind of complex question. And also we have to be, I think we have to think of local cultures, local customs, and traditions. And so I think we have these revolutionary figures, but I also think it's, for me, for example, Mandela is like a really revolutionary figure in South Africa, right? It's this kind of icon. But his policies really were very conformist. You know, one can ask what really changed in South Africa. Certain things, of course, the constitution changed. And so at a very real level, that changed people's lives. But large parts of our country continue to live in abject poverty, don't have access to running water, you know. So then one has to ask, you know, is that the revolution? Is that the revolutionary figure I want to invest in? But I do think it's a really difficult. I think it's a difficult question to grapple with. But I do think that there is at least there are traditions from the global South that do give us at least some kind of, you know, a different way of thinking about anarchism in terms of more, you know, dealing with more local and global South issues.
Well, actually, sorry, sorry. Yeah, can I add actually my question or some idea on it? Yeah, we are now talking about a global South, and then you would actually know that history of a non-alignment movement, and Petra also pointed out at the moment is this, you know, the power, you know, the global power do not actually allow us to choose alternative, you know. Actually, that, in my opinion, that is actually axiomatic of this current, you know, the post-war regime. And then I think actually Putin, you know, didn't want to actually abolish this, you know, regime, you know, because, you know, you would know we are faced up in a serious climate change and the environment, you know, disaster, you know, approaching us, you know, in near future. And then, you know, I loved in Petra's the description, you know, that we are the communal suicidal, you know, collective suicidal, you know, the moment. I think that's why actually even, you know, the America, you know, the United States decided to actually turn their energy policy toward, you know, environment friendly, you know, the you know, the source, something like that. But I think this kind of transitory moment, you know, in my opinion, stimulated, you know, provoked, you know, Putin, you know, invade, you know, the Ukraine, because he did not want to actually to change this world, but, you know, keep this kind of order, because they actually must export the, you know, the oil and then, you know, natural source, you know, for supporting this global regime, of course, which does not allow us, you know, choose the alternative. Is actually they try to divide, you know, split this world into two parts, and then they actually, you know, force us to choose one of them. I think this is actually today's, you know, sort of, you know, the axiomatic politics. But in my opinion, the politics is always ontological. It means that even though it looks like a politic, it's not a politic. It's kind of the axiomatic. That means more like a moralistic, you know, the enslavement, you know, is they try to enslave us onto that kind of you know, order, you know, imperative, something like that. But you know, the Deleuze-Guattari, and then I think actually the Chantal's, you know, the reading of Deleuze-Guattari from the perspective of anarchism, you know, whether, you know, the Deleuze-Guattari is anarchist or not, is not important. My idea is Deleuze wouldn't, you know, agree that, you know, Deleuze and Guattari wouldn't agree that, you know, whether we actually discuss, you know, the anarchism or not. But thing is that, you know, what they try to do in terms of politics is definitely how to create, you know, the third. That means actually the becoming revolutionary is on the left. That is very important, you know, what Deleuze said. Leftist is not important. You know, leftism is not important. That means, you know, whether you are anarchist, whether you are communist, whether you are, you know, whatever, not important. But becoming or being revolutionary, you know, becoming minor, becoming animal, becoming women, every kind of this, you know, becoming should be, you know, the indicating the kind of becoming revolutionary. Is becoming minor means becoming revolutionary, becoming global south, becoming revolutionary. But and then my idea is, what is this kind of becoming? You know, I think to my interpretation, there might be some creation of the third world. You know, it's not the global south. Global south is more geographical, you know, terminology. But the third world is more like, you know, even though actually, you know, we said third world, but third world is not geographically classified. That means it's a little bit, you know, like a belt, you know, political belt, you know, it's a non-alignment belt, something like that. So that's why I prefer the third world, and I want to revive this term, third world. And then that's what, of course, actually, these days, third world sounds like you know, poor country, you know, some sort of country has not, you know, developed enough, something like that, on underdevelopment, something like that. But in my opinion, the third might be a very revolutionary term. In this sense, actually, we can say the anarchism will be some third, you know, the category against this sort of, you know, the established, you know, political regime. And then in this way, the anarchism is not kind of political, you know, strategy, but rather, you know, kind of idea of the third, you know, the looking forward kind of alternative to what we experience at the moment, what's happening, and then the sort of a power relationship, you know, or some kind of idea by which we can create some new assemblage of desire, you know, toward my preferable, you know, word is communism. That's why just I said, you know, anarchism would be a final state of communism, you know, not actually anarchism is like a passage toward communism. That's what I'm thinking, you know, when I read your book.
It's interesting that you it is interesting, this idea of, you know, one kind of imperialism or the other, and the, you know, I think the debates that happened online and the divisive nature of this was quite interesting, because I mean, actually, it's just, they're both evils, and, you know, you don't have to choose between the one or the other. They're both evils. Of course, in the situation, maybe we can, you know, we can also be sensitive to context and so on. But I think this is, in fact, one of the interesting things that Deleuze does, or I should say Deleuze and Guattari do for thought, right? Is to introduce terms, a third term. They do that quite often in their work, because I think we're inculcated with, you know, from birth to think in these very binary ways. It becomes so naturalized and normalized that it is very difficult to sometimes think a third term, an alternative possibility. And I think that is, you know, that I think is actually one of the most important things we can do for liberating our own thinking and even our practices, is to kind of pose that question to ourselves: what other options are there? And yeah, I mean, I like this idea of like anarchism as a, you know, a third idea, at least an alternative. But I think that there's, you know, the world is so replete with like systems of domination, of hierarchies of oppression. It's sometimes very difficult to disentangle these, especially when we feel quite emotionally attached to something. I think the war, you know, has moved many of us to think about politics and what the world is and what can happen at any moment. You know, and why one man is allowed to live out his destructive fantasy for this long. I mean, it's quite crazy that's, you know, that, and I think we've all experienced this kind of powerlessness. You know, we're watching food prices go up and, you know, petrol prices go up, and we feel kind of powerless, and we're just like watching these players play out their fantasies. And I think that for me is part of what I hope anarchism can do for people, and it is this idea that we have to give up our power and kind of live out our lives according to other people's whims, because I think that is how a lot of us feel and what the world looks like in real terms. And so that is really it is the big challenge, because of course it's not going to happen overnight. We can't, you know, maybe if there's some great mass uprising, you know, one can always hope for the revolution, for the big revolution. But more realistically, I think, you know, we have to change those things every day. And it really starts with our thoughts and with changing what we think is possible. I think that's a big challenge. Yeah.
Can I continue that? So listening to Tai Kwang's point and then your response, and I think I'd play a little bit devil's advocate here. So we all know that the right wing across the planet has captured the political will, and the left is the left of what people who are not right wing are left not able to respond, not able to kind of compete with this capturing of the political will. So when Tai Kwang's talking about the kind of the third world, okay, and then he gave a big list of becoming this, becoming that. Well, you know, that's a kind of, it suggests to me a kind of political impotence. And we can have lots of becoming and doing this, that, another, but it's outside history. Okay, so my idea about anarchism, I want it in history. I want to live an anarchist life. I don't want religion, and I don't want the church, and I don't want the state. I want freedom. I want to carry out my desires and live a life of absolute freedom as far as possible. But it seems to me that to play the devil's advocate, Deleuze's philosophy and indeed anarchism has this, you could say, this idea of some kind of third world and perhaps an eruption of the third world, which 1968 would be this idea of the eruption. Okay, somehow there's an eruption, something changes, but it hasn't been sustained, so it's not in history. It's just becoming this, blah blah blah. So we kind of affirm the event, as you said, revolution would be the event or something like that, but it still means political impotence. Okay, so then the devil's advocate position would be that anarchists are very ethical. They try to lead ethical lives, and Deleuze's philosophy could be considered kind of ethics of becoming, but there is no political philosophy there to sustain the history, to make anarchism present in history, to give us a way of life. So considering that kind of harsh, critical viewpoint, what would be your response?
I mean, I think there is anarchism now in history. It is marginal, I will concede. It is still a marginal philosophy. Or a marginal, no, I don't want to call it a philosophy. I want to call it a politics. It is a marginal politics. And a lot of that does, I think, have to do with the amount of work that states have put in to discredit anarchism right from its early roots. I think that, you know, I do think that, of course, I think that the left I think the right has captured something, political will. But when we think about this, what is that political will? That political will, okay, we have seen like the Proud Boys and the storming of the Capitol and whatever. So there has been a small amount of people who have been moved to action. But in fact, the larger part of people haven't actually been moved to action. What they have done is voted for right-wing leaders, and they have found a way to vent their frustration, mostly online. And so this is a really interesting question, because this then asks the question about what politics is. And what the right wing have done is they have picked up something about what a digital milieu does in terms of capturing the instant moment. And so there's this instant moment in which I can vent my anger and I can say what I want and I can be a misogynist. And so there is this like, they basically created a channel for people to vent. For me, that's not politics. They've captured something, I agree, something important. But it's not politics. And so I do think this is where this is the question we as the left and as anarchists then have to answer, is how do we do politics that responds to what the right has captured? And what they've done is actually divert people's energy from politics. That's what they've gotten right. And so what the question I think that we have to answer is, if we want to live an anarchist life, we want to live this life of freedom, how do we do politics? And for me, again, I truly believe that this does require, so this kind of online life, it allows for a kind of laziness. And so part of recapturing politics is finding a way of doing, not just like this becoming, as you say, becoming this, becoming that, becoming this, but a way of practically doing. And so for me, I often ask this for myself even, like, if I want to save the planet, does it mean giving up certain things? Because what are my own investments of desire that keep me from having the life that I want to live? And so I think that those are really, these are difficult questions to answer. What keeps us then collectively from producing the leftist politics that we want to see in the world? What might I have to give up or change? Or how might I have to reinvest my desire to accomplish that? And I think what we also have to remember is that, this rise of the right didn't happen overnight. A lot of money and effort has been put into it for many, many, many years. We need to do the same. We need to take our energy and spend it on creating this alternative world for ourselves.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah.
Otherwise, go ahead.
No, I completely disagree with Job. I think becoming is important. Third one is really important. And I think it's a question of affect also. I was curious, there is no specific, there are elaborations on affect, various aspects of affect in this book in terms of micropolitics. immanent critique, differential affective attunement, and all those things. But there is no affect as not as a major political category is dealt with in the book. And you were focusing on your taking two examples from Foucault in terms of diagram and discipline. And I was thinking the relation between power and affect. I will give you one example to exemplify that. It is again from my own example. When we go to school in the morning, like till 10 o'clock in the morning, it's a multiplicity of students running in the ground and all. With the school bell rang, like we suddenly become an assembly. We are disciplined. The multiplicity is like being reduced to identity of one. We listen to the headmaster. We listen to the national anthem. The affect is different. Oh my God, this is like a long day ahead and I'm like doomed right now. But at the same time, the same headmaster, the same bell, the same building, the same space, enclosures. In the evening, there is an assembly and a national anthem before the school leaves. There is another power operating over there. But my affect to that power situation is different because I'm going to be liberated and I'm going to the home, like, going to the playground right now. So there is some way, this like very nuanced relation between power and affect, like, in its operation. So I think the concept of affect is really important as well as, like, when you talk about authority, I don't know whether, like you say, the desire to the desire kind of getting hijacked by like the liking to the authority is also can be explained in terms of certain affects playing out. Also, I'm not sure, but I'm really curious about the relation between the power and the affect, and it's playing out in the larger. What is your take on that?
I totally agree with you, and I think I at least hinted at this earlier, but I think the right has gotten something right in terms of affect, right? Instead of giving people a pamphlet with 7,000 things on whatever and whatever, they've captured affect. And so I think that actually there is this very close relationship between power and affect, both in its negative iterations and in its positive iterations. I think part of why this kind of online life, for example, if we think about the power of online life, part of that is because it's designed to give you dopamine hits, right? So I'm sort of thinking quite a lot about dopamine these days because it's these like it's this quick feel-good mechanism. And it's been built into all of these platforms. And so that's a kind of, it's a very powerful tool, right? And so I think that for us to experience power in its positive iteration, we do have to explore affect. There does have to be a link between, what it feels like it must feel good. Man, it must feel good to be a leftist. That's what it comes down to, right? Is it must feel good. And it must feel like we're powerful together. Otherwise it's just an intellectual exercise, which is fine. You can also have a great experience. Some people also have great experiences from intellectual, whatever exercises. But I think that this thing that you're raising is really, really important. And I do think that there's a close link. And I think that it's also one of the things that is maybe the most difficult to identify. Because it is a very nuanced relationship. As you say, even the same thing can feel quite different at different times. It's a very good example that you gave, because I think that shows how complex this relationship is. I think even and maybe this, you know, I'm sure this is true for all of us, maybe sometimes we all feel like, maybe, you know, you have a moment where you feel like really happy to live in a state of society because of X, Y, and Z. So yeah, so I think it is a complex relationship, and I don't think I think we would do well to understand that a bit more, and you know, and kind of like really, yeah, understand affect in terms of political terms, not just in terms of philosophical terms, for example.
Anybody?
Well, yeah, I want to. I was waiting for Peter to jump in, but he's going to do that in a minute. I know.
You first, Joe. Go ahead.
So, yeah, one thing that when I was a young guy is I read a lot of Peter Alexkovich Kropotkin, yeah, and I read a small essay, Appeal to the Young. I don't know if you come across it. And I was totally, yeah, I mean, I was very much impressed by that, because in this essay, he asked young people, what are they going to do when they go into the world? Are they going to work for, you know, like a big company and just accrue money and care for their family, immediate family and so on, or just take pleasure out of life? Or are they going to help those people who are in a different way of living, they're struggling to make ends meet and so on? But that was, you know, that on one level, that's pretty straightforward. Religious people always ask those questions to you. But the other part of it was that he said, what are we going to do with technology now? Okay. I mean, it's not, he says it's not so much that we're going to use machines so that the human body isn't exhausted constantly, okay? But he says, are we going to use the machines in a way that somehow what you said about giving joy to be a leftist, right? Like a joy to promote community or a joy to promote freedom. So how do we use technologies to somehow to maximize our joy of living? Okay. Now I was totally impressed by that idea. And then recently I went back to it and I realized that both Guattari and Bernard Stiegler are asking the same question. As you said, the way that the platforms now are organized is somehow to give us an immediate gratification, to spend our frustrations or hatred upon life. So both Guattari and Stiegler, I think, are asking the question about how do we create those technologies which give us that kind of joyous sense of community. And I think that is a real question. I think the anarchists do a very good job in trying to answer that. So I think, like, as I was playing devil's advocate, behind that is the question of, like, Deleuze and Guattari are great philosophers, okay? And Guattari worked of course, in Laborde, trying to change his society and in his community in that way. But critics will say that, critics will say that the philosophers are not getting their hands dirty. The anarchists are getting their hands dirty, but the philosophers are not. But Bernard Stiegler, I mean, he's failed, well, you could say arguably he wasn't successful, the Plain Commune, Saint-Denis. He actually tried to use technologies in that sense of taking away that the attention grabbing that the platforms do, to use technologies in a way that give us back some sense of a communal bond or even a paternal bond, right? I mean, his example, the smartphone, grabs the attention of the child. The transitional objects of the smartphone grabs the attention of the child, so that when the mother's using it, that is, so that the child is constantly wanting the smartphone, rather, because they want the attention of the mother. So he wants to change those technologies in a way, and I think the anarchists, thinking like the tools of conviviality and things like that, want to do that much better than some contemporary philosophers. So I was thinking, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of I think in terms of theorizing what what is happening to us, to subjectivity, to the environment, to our world in the digital milieu. I think, to me, that is probably where the philosophers are important, you know, helping us. And for me, Stigler's work is paradigmatic there. It's really given me a lot of ways. It's given me tools to grapple with this thing that I see happening, that I've been trying to understand, especially, you know, with my students and so on. But I do think that that anarchists have a long history of practicing communal DIY kind of ways of living and doing life differently and caring for each other. Because, you know, this is, again, this question of care. This is really interesting because, of course, it's a very big theme in Stigler's work. But I actually think that I think that care is, in fact, at the core principle, I would say, of anarchism. Because it is caring for our environment, it's caring for ourselves, it's learning, you know, to look after each other in ways that, you know, that help us grow together. And I think even, you know, if you think of hacker spaces, that kind of thing, I think even, I quite like that idea of returning to hacker spaces, but in a kind of enlarged way, you know, where we're teaching each other more about these technologies and how to have better relationships to them, where we're teaching each other also other skills, especially related maybe to the environment, like how to grow food. You know, coming back to the question of the global south, I think that's a very practical, something very practical that we can do as anarchists, is learning to grow food together. Because I think these are the things we face quite immediately, you know, beyond the kind of grand ideas and so on. There are these kind of immediate needs that we need. You know, it doesn't help you talk to your students about technology and how bad it is for them if they haven't eaten for a couple of days, and you know, or they don't, you know, they sleep in a place where they don't even have access to running water, and I think those very practical ways of being social beings is what anarchism really has such a strong history of.
Petra?
Yeah,
Do you have a last question? Yeah.
I do have a question that actually is related to what Chantelle was saying in her previous comment. When you were referring to the ways state castrates or desire or cuts us off from what we really want, it reminded me of the first chapter of your book, where you describe those techniques that the state uses to make us believe that it is necessary and inevitable. And it seems to me that this politics of fear, when state wants us to believe that without state we will fall into total chaos and to the dog-eat-dog lifestyle, there is also one more aspect that we tend to forget. This politics of fear has also the opposite side, namely the state wants us to believe that it could have been much worse. Like, think of France, where people are supposed to be grateful that they have a Macron as a president, because it could have been Le Pen, and the whole EU would collapse, and it would be disaster for everyone. You know, same applies to Russia, where people should be grateful that they have Putin as a president, because look at Chechnya, where they have Kadyrov, who is way more ruthless, and this is, you know, how it could be. And basically, the state also makes us to live in this fear that you know, there could be a way worse situation. I would like to ask you, Chantelle, how would you describe this opposite side of fear that basically prevents us from doing what we want and make us content ourselves with what we have?
Yeah. Yeah, of course, this is, you know, if you look at to give an example of the animal liberation movement, which of course was closely, you know, which was anarchist, when people started taking action, the state kind of intervened by criminalizing these kind of ecological counter movements to such an extent that people got these crazy jail sentences. This continues, of course. And so obviously then, you know, it's easy to retreat. One wants to retreat. You know, it's very difficult to take part in a protest if you think you're going to be thrown into jail. Or, yeah, as you say, there is always this idea, you know, even in South Africa, you know, people will think, you know, we had like this state capture during the Zuma years, but people think, you know, it's still better than the apartheid years. So I think that, you know, that is part of it's a strong tactic, I think, of states to do that. And I think it has become far more insidious with surveillance capitalism, because of course we're tracked in so many ways. And we've seen clampdowns on movements, everything from small protests to Black Lives Matter. And so I think those tactics are, of course, it's almost like it's got to keep you in your place. That's the idea, is to keep you in your place. And so, yeah, I think this is, you know, thinking of how to change society at a large scale then becomes very difficult, because I don't think those fears are unreasonable. And but I do also think that it is part of statist realism. It is the limits of our imagination also. And it is part, I think, of our task to challenge those ideas in ourselves. I think we all fall prey to it sometimes, you know, but to challenge those ideas, like, you know, because if we did really rise up en masse, and I mean en masse, something would have to change, right? But it's taking that step that is terrifying, because what if you're not enough? What if you get put into jail? What if, you know, maybe this is the best for us. Maybe this is the best we can do right now. I think that those are, you you know, and I think a lot of people also work longer hours these days. You know, we're sort of trapped in by our lives in many ways. So practicing politics, whether it's in our minds, starting in our minds and changing our ideas, or doing things collectively, sometimes I think feels even like a bit of a sacrifice, because you have to maybe not invest so much in work, or have ways to disengage without feeling like you're going to be in trouble or something's going to happen, or, you know. So, but I do think it starts with challenging ourselves in terms of, it's a kind of complacency, I think. And I think part of it is it's not because people are bad or because they don't want to change, really. I think honestly, a lot of people just feel very overwhelmed by their lives a lot of the time. You know, there's just so much to do and so much to get through, and, you know, are they gonna, you know, worrying about money and food and whatever. So I think, you know, those are things that put limitations on what we can do. But again, if we start practicing politics collectively and look after each other in different ways to alleviate those kinds of limitations, it helps us to not only practice a different politics, but start imagining a different kind of world. I sound like a rally speaker.
Excellent answer. And I think actually the time is already, you know, over the 1.5. So do you want more discussion otherwise? And then we promised another opportunity to discuss this topic later. All right. Okay. So please, closing man.
Right. So I thought that the way Chantelle finished her discussion there was actually the right moment to finish, because the suggestion that, as she rightly says, of taking care of our friends and our local community, and in doing so to create, as she says, a social being, which is a real anarchist concept. That idea, in that practice, as Chantelle says, in that practice, something is prefigured, something comes into being, and something suggestive of a new way to organize our lives, our collective lives. And I think that is the point where Deleuze's philosophy and anarchism, broadly understood, seems to go together. And I think in her book, Chantelle's book, she rightly focuses on the people to come, right? Yeah, the missing people and so on. And it's quite right that this concept has become very conspicuous because the people are missing. I mean, the fact that we as Chantelle says, we cannot kind of imagine something beyond the dogmatic images of thought, or the doxa, which prevents us from thinking a way of life beyond the state. So at that moment, the utopian part that Petra mentioned, that is clearly part of the anarchist project, but it's something more than utopianism. It is in the practice of a social being, in the coming together and caring for each other, and of that the prospects of another communism, a community to come, is brought into being. And that, I think, is Chantelle brought that out absolutely wonderfully in her book. So I want to thank Chantelle for sharing her time. And I have no idea what time it is in South Africa at the moment, I'm afraid. Although it is quite close to, well, it's supposed to, yeah, it's not that bad, I suppose.
No.
But even so, right, the fact that I can't imagine what time it is over there, right? Well, I want to thank you very much for sharing your time, and for Petra for jumping in and offering such brilliant observations as well. And it's actually it's a topic that's really dear to my heart, and I've fallen out of love with anarchism, I've got to admit, over the years, but I'm actually falling back into love with it now. So thank you very, very much.
And thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your participation, and then see you next time. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Take care and have a nice day.
Peter, thanks,
or
Peter.
Good night
Yeah.
for those in Asia.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.